A video maker by the name of Kraut-Saga went completely mental yesterday talking about RK selection theory in humans. Now, I really don't care about RK selection theory. I'm just reacting to Kraut on this. In animals, our selection is having a lot of offspring with low investment and a low survival chance, but you have so many that some get through and are able to reproduce. While K selection is having a smaller number of offspring with a high investment but a higher survival chance. Kraut actually explained all this pretty well, so give him credit for that. Example of an R-type species would be a dandelion, to a lesser extent a salmon that lays hundreds of eggs. A K-type species would be whales, humans, canines to a lesser extent, and birds would be somewhere intermediate on this scale. In 1967, E.O. Wilson and Robert MacArthur applied this kind of thinking within humans. Philippe Rushton wrote a booklet entitled Race, Evolution, and Behavior, which I think is the seminal work on this. Kraut, however, doesn't know about any of this, saying,
"Well, why is it that I do not find a single scientific paper on this amazing theory of RK-type evolutionary psychology that the alt-right proclaims to have found and which supposedly explains political, intellectual, and racial differences on an evolutionary basis? Why is it that the only end source I find are the book by anonymous conservative and an alt-right blog? Well, because all this talk about the application of the RK selection theory within the human species amongst individuals is nothing short of worthless, self-aggrandizing, pathetic, and extraordinarily stupid pseudoscientific gibberish."
This is willful ignorance on Kraut's part. Now, I don't expect you to know about E.O. Wilson, MacArthur, or Rushton. Okay, the average Joe could be forgiven for thinking that RK selection was just something the anonymous conservative brought up and some YouTubers echoed. But Kraut is not the average Joe. Kraut should know better because I offered to walk Kraut through race realism and to work with him on his videos. I could have told him about RK selection theory in humans, among many, many other things, in private. Instead, he's going to have to get this lesson in public. When Wilson, MacArthur, and Rushton were saying that groups of humans may be slightly more R or K selected than other groups of humans, they're not saying that black people lay eggs, but that there might be some slight variation on the RK continuum. For example, more R selected animals tend to mature faster and have shorter gestation periods than K selected animals. Okay, well, race differences in pregnancy lengths are a replicated finding. Blacks and South Asians tend to have shorter pregnancy lengths than Europeans in Britain, about 7 days shorter on average. A 1987 study in the United States found that blacks in New York City, on average, gave birth 4.4 days earlier than whites in New York City, while blacks in South Carolina gave birth 7.7 days earlier on average. And I think the difference between New York City blacks and South Carolina blacks is due to admixture. We can also look at a 2013 study from the CDC, which among other things reported the rate of premature births by race. We can also look at the average age of onset of puberty in Mexican American, white, and black males and females. There are also several studies looking at differences in newborn reactivity between the races. So there's all sorts of things like this that are well established in humans. So the RK people, they use these kinds of differences as a starting point of analysis for race differences in psychological traits. And I think that this is a little bit of a spandrel. This RK continuum, I don't think it's very useful. And like most evolutionary psychology, it's very speculative, but it's not what Kraut is making it out to be. Now, this video that I've been playing throughout, this is a quick overview of racial differences in infant development, with African and Australian Aborigine infants being more developed at birth than European infants, who are more developed at birth than either Navajo or Japanese infants. What Kraut then does is make a very extreme typological syllogism, claiming no RK differences within species.
These two categories are cemented, set in stone, biological categories with no leeway or room for overlap. Cannot separate a species from the sexual reproductive strategy that it has evolved to have.
Now, this is a very bizarre proclamation. We can look at average gestation time and litter size for domestic cats, for example. Those are not the same, even though they're all the same species. We can look at differences in gestation periods between breeds of horses and ponies. Those are not the same, despite being the same species. We have data on domestic dogs and how breeds vary in litter size and gestation period. Those are not the same, despite them being the same species. The best data on this sorts of stuff seems to be on farm animals and pet animals. With wild animals, you tend to just get sort of vague ranges, and subspecies data on wild animals is very hard to find. However, I was able to find data on age of male sexual maturity and gestation periods for 3 subspecies of tiger. In addition to the data on humans, we have several animal species that show subspecies variation in RK traits. So Kraut's sort of absolute proclamation that RK traits cannot vary within a species is just wrong. I don't care if you got that from your experts. If you did, then your experts are either wrong or, more likely, they simply didn't know what was being talked about. Here's what I think happened. Kraut talks to one of his experts and he told him, the alt-right says that races differ on the RK sexual strategy scale. And his experts immediately thought in terms of the kind of large-scale cross-species differences that you normally think of when you think of the RK sexual strategy continuum. Not, say, a weak difference in gestation or black newborns having the motor skills of a 1-month-old European infant. Now, a clue that this is what happened is that he keeps babbling about the method of sexual reproduction, bringing up this slide over and over again as if it's some sort of in-your-face refutation of RK selection theory in humans. Again, I don't care about RK selection theory in humans, and this video has been very tedious to make because I have such little interest in the topic. I'm simply reacting to Kraut on this. Now, the punchline of RK selection theory in humans is differences in psychology. And this is why I don't care about RK selection theory in humans, because while I am a very, very big fan of measuring race differences in mental traits, just measure the mental traits. There's no need to speculate about the evolutionary origins, which is why I fundamentally don't care about RK selection theory in humans. It's a just so story that doesn't really matter once you know what the differences are. But Kraut then engaged in something so dishonest that I had to do a double take when I saw it, just to make sure I actually saw what I saw. So first, here's a clip of Millennial Woes saying something. Just listen to this.
Within these nationalist circles, you get guys who are not naturally K-types. Indeed, I'm one of them, to be honest, but that's another story. I'll talk about specifically a certain type of guy who gets involved in nationalism, and, well, it's not just one type, but they have this thing in common, which is that they weren't born K-types. They weren't born steady, practical, thinking long-term, and so on. But they, at some point, adopted or tried to adopt it, resolved to develop those qualities.
Okay, now, obviously Millennial Woes is talking about behavior that he thinks of as being on sort of an RK continuum. I'm not a fan of what Woes is doing. I wish he wouldn't use a concept of reproductive strategies to describe things like, saving money, exercising, being diligent at work, finding a spouse, settling down, etc. I wish he wouldn't describe that using the RK continuum. That said, it's pretty clear that Woes is not talking about changing his fundamental physiology. He's not talking about laying eggs versus live birth, okay? What kind of a moron would you have to be to think that's what Millennial Woes was talking about? This kind of moron.
He believes he can change his mammalian biological sexual reproduction strategy and presumably the sexual reproduction organs that have all evolved over the course of 220 million years by his ancestors through the power of sheer will.
Or maybe Kraut isn't a moron, maybe he's just dishonest. But how? I mean, this is so brazen, I have a hard time imagining that Kraut could be either this dishonest or this demented. But here it is, unbelievable. And yet, it stands right before us. Kraut then goes on to say another whopper.
Between R and K type in accordance to a biologically inherited political alignment or skin pigment, as if being liberal or black makes you have sex like a reptile, fish, or amphibian.
Buddy, skin pigmentation is caused by a hormone known as melanin. Yes, melanin is a pigment, but it's also a hormone. And it is well known that the presence of melanin increases violence and aggression in any animal that's injected with it. I don't expect the average Joe to know this, and I don't expect either of Kraut's experts to know this either, okay? It's not their specialty. And if it's not their specialty, they're not any more likely to know this than the average person is. But I offered to help Kraut on his videos and his study of the topic. Again, if you had just talked to me, as I offered, and he explicitly rejected, he would not have made this error. And this is what people were criticizing you for, Kraut. They weren't going, how dare you talk to academics? I mean, that's how you characterize it, but nobody is against you for talking to academics. I talk to academics all the time. They were criticizing you for making a big attack on race realism, and now I guess you're trying to shoehorn in alt-right or whatever, without talking to any of the race realists that you were attacking, that you were only talking to them and not to the people that you were in opposition to. And the result of this has been a total clusterfuck mountain of straw and shit. Now, early on in his video, he asked the oh so profound and oh so serious and deep-minded question.
Have you ever heard of the Dunning-Kruger effect?
Yes, clown, everyone has. It is the go-to insult of every pseudo-intellectual under the fucking sun. Now, maybe before grandstanding like this, you should consider that perhaps you wouldn't be so confident and grandiose in your denunciations of RK selection theory in humans if you knew who E.O. Wilson or Philippe Rushton were. You spent at least 3 months on this, and you refused advisement from any of the race realists, and you refused any kind of review of your videos from race realists. And if your experts advised you on this video, well then so far, they don't know what the fuck they're talking about. This video was Kraut priming the pump, finding something that he thought he could convince public was a big gotcha. Right, designed to reduce the credibility of race realists. Right, he uses the term alt-right, and that's just another tactic. Right, he's using the negative association of alt-right to attack race realism because half of race realists are alt-right. But I don't think that's going to happen. I think this is going to backfire. I think he's going to find that his experts are clueless, and he's going to have a very bad time denying evolution above the neck in humans.
Sexual reproduction is, after all, how species are differentiated from each other within the science of biology.
His video is full of all these stupid little prick points. All throughout, he says crap like this. Now, the issue of what constitutes a species is a point of endless debate among taxonomists, and there are multiple general definitions of species as well as all of the variations within those definitions as to how those definitions are applied. But no, you got Mr. Fake British Aristocrat accent here telling us the definition of species in
the science of biology.
No less. And when responding to him, you have to ignore so many of these little shitballs that he throws out. Otherwise, your response is going to be 3 hours long because it always takes longer to clean up his mess than it does for him to make it.